There are moments in history when the world seems to stop, when a single voice cuts through centuries of silence and forces us to listen. In the heart of West Africa, a young man barely past his 30s has done what seasoned leaders dared not attempt. Captain Ibrahim Traore, now the head of Burkina Faso, declared healthcare free for all, opened the doors of education without charge, built mobile hospitals that roll into forgotten villages, and told his people that a home is not a privilege, but a right. Within 2 years, his government employed thousands, launched new industries, and raised national pride. But as his people rise, the shadows deepen. Reports speak of no fewer than 18 attempts on his life. Western powers, once comfortable with Africa's submission, now find themselves unsettled by a new spirit. And while his enemies sharpen their knives, voices from across the seas, from Jamaica to Harlem, from the Caribbean to Chicago, have begun to echo his name. Stay with us. This story is more than headlines. It is a movement our elders prayed for. Subscribe, share, and walk with us for a new Africa rising. On a humid September evening in 2022, the sound of boots echoed through the streets of Ouagadougou. The air was thick with tension, yet also with expectation. A young captain, Ibrahim Traore, led his men not with the arrogance of conquest, but with the urgency of survival. His country, Burkina Faso, had been battered by decades of instability, foreign meddling, and the silent hunger of its people. When the government faltered, Traore stepped forward. He did not speak like the old politicians. He spoke like a soldier who had seen the despair in the villages and could no longer remain still. What followed has astonished the continent. In less than 2 years, Traore initiated reforms that many thought impossible in a lifetime. He declared that health care would no longer be a burden but a right. Hospitals would treat the poor and the wealthy alike. He proclaimed that every child, regardless of background, would sit in a classroom without paying fees. He ordered mobile hospitals to travel into the countryside, where elders had long suffered without medicine. His economic policy struck even harder at the old order. He employed 8,000 citizens in a single day, reducing the sea of unemployment that had drowned so many young dreams. He told his ministers and parliamentarians to cut their own salaries by 30%, while raising the wages of civil servants by half. In the same breath, he paid off local debts and invested in agriculture, opening tomato processing plants that once seemed like a dream. The changes were not only economic. They were symbolic acts of sovereignty. He halted the export of raw gold to Europe, insisting it be refined on African soil. He expelled French troops from Burkina Faso and banned French media outlets that had long painted the country as weak and dependent. For the first time in generations, citizens felt the weight of colonial hands lifting from their shoulders. It was, many said, the spirit of Thomas Sankara reborn. News of these acts did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. They traveled like fire through dry grass across the Atlantic. In Jamaica, the land of Marcus Garvey and reggae prophecy, musicians began to sing of Traore. "Wake up, Africa," they cried, echoing across dance halls and church pulpits. Social media carried these voices, weaving together Kingston, Accra, Lagos, and Atlanta in a shared rhythm of awakening. Among these voices was one that startled the world. Usain Bolt, the fastest man on earth, the Jamaican sprinter whose name is known in every corner of the globe. He did not simply post a message of solidarity. He wrote a formal letter to President Traore. In it, he praised the young leader's vision, his refusal to bow to pressure, and his insistence that sovereignty was not negotiable. Bolt spoke of the power of sport to unite, of youth as the builders of tomorrow, and of his willingness to support Burkina Faso in any way possible. The letter was read aloud in videos, replayed in churches, and quoted on Caribbean radio. Diaspora audiences, from Harlem barbershops to London community halls, heard in Bolt's words a validation of their own yearning. At last, a living African leader was doing what generations had prayed for, refusing to sell out, refusing to kneel, and insisting that Africa's wealth belonged to its children. For the elders in the diaspora, many past 60, This was not just news. It was memory resurrected. They remembered when Lumumba's speeches carried hope before his murder silenced him. They remembered the glow of Kwame Nkrumah, who dreamed of a United States of Africa and how that dream was strangled by a coup. They remembered Sankara's youth and Gaddafi's defiance, both cut short by assassins' bullets and foreign bombs. And now, in the eyes of a new generation, they saw Ibrahim Traore stepping into the same dangerous light. But even as the songs rose, rumors of danger grew louder. Reports whispered of conspiracies in foreign embassies, of agents slipping money to stir protests abroad, of betrayal waiting in the shadows. The story of a young soldier turned president was inspiring millions. Yet in Africa, history has taught us that inspiration often comes with a price. And so we must ask, as the drums of support grow louder across oceans, will Traore's enemies strike back before his vision has time to take root? History in Africa is written not only in ink but in blood. To understand the intensity surrounding Captain Ibrahim Traoré, one must recall the echoes of past betrayals. On the 17th of January 1961, Patrice Lumumba of Congo was cut down in his prime, his body hidden away, his dream of sovereignty silenced by foreign interests. On the 24th of February 1966, Kwame Nkrumah, champion of Pan-African unity, was toppled while on his way to Vietnam for peace talks. On the 15th of October 1987, Thomas Sankara, young, charismatic, determined to lift Burkina Faso, was assassinated at the age of only 37. And on the 20th of October 2011, as Muslims across the world observed a holy day, Muammar Gaddafi was killed in Libya under NATO bombs. For many across the black world, these names are not just chapters in dusty textbooks. They are scars on the soul. Every time Africa produced a leader who dared to say no to colonial masters, that leader was swiftly removed. Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara, Gaddafi, the list is long and the grief is deep. It is against this backdrop that Traore's defiance has taken root. When word spread that he had faced 18 assassination attempts in only 2 years, outrage boiled over. Jamaicans, Caribbeans, Africans in America and Europe, voices once scattered, rose as one. The cry was not timid. It was thunderous. Touch him and you touch us all. In Kingston, Rastafarian singers chanted his name beside portraits of Garvey and Haile Selassie. In Brooklyn, elders spoke of him as if he were a grandson stepping into destiny. In Accra, students held vigils, holding candles and placards declaring, "Africa will not bow again." The diaspora was no longer whispering in private corners. They were marching in the streets. The climax came with the call for coordinated demonstrations on the 30th of April. From Jamaica to the Bahamas, from Haiti to Guyana, from Harlem to Atlanta, rallies were announced. Africans on the continent pledged to march in solidarity. It was to be the first time in recent memory that black people across continents would take to the streets on the same day for the same cause, to shield one young leader from the fate that had befallen so many before him. The emotional energy was raw. In impassioned videos, speakers warned Western governments directly, do not dare repeat history. Do not dare create another Lumumba, another Sankara, another Gaddafi. They spoke with anger but also with resolve. Many invoked the prophecy of a united Africa, claiming that Traoré was the spark foretold by seers and musicians. Some even said that every black person, no matter where they lived, should hold citizenship in Africa, the ancestral homeland finally rising from centuries of division. Even soldiers in Burkina Faso became part of the narrative. Stories spread of officers who had been offered millions of dollars to betray Traoré, yet chose instead to expose the plot and invest the money back into their country. Whether every detail was verifiable mattered less than the symbolism. Loyalty was stronger than bribery. This was no longer only about one man. It was about memory, dignity, and survival. The diaspora carried wounds from centuries of slavery, colonization, and betrayal. Now, in the face of a leader who dared to resist, they were unwilling to let history repeat itself. If Lumumba had been left unprotected, if Sankara had been abandoned, they vowed that Traoré would not be. Yet with every chant and every march, the tension grew. Supporters celebrated his courage, but enemies too were listening. Western capitals, unaccustomed to seeing Africans rally around a leader so fiercely, began to calculate their moves. Would sanctions be imposed? Would covert operations intensify? Would neighboring governments, uneasy with his popularity, be pressured to act? The stage was set, emotions burning high, history hovering over the present like a ghost. Across oceans, from the Caribbean to Africa, millions asked the same question. Could this young captain escape the tragic cycle that had claimed so many before him? And in that question lies the suspense. Will Traoré's story become another mournful elegy, or will it mark the turning of Africa's tide at last? When a young officer seizes power, the expectation is usually chaos. Yet in Burkina Faso, the early effects of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rule have been the opposite. In the short term, ordinary citizens felt changes they could touch with their own hands. Teachers no longer demanded fees from children whose parents struggled to pay. Clinics, once empty and abandoned, began to hum with life as medicine arrived without a bill. Civil servants returned home with pay that finally stretched beyond survival. For the first time in years, families whispered to each other, "Maybe tomorrow will not be worse than today." The reforms also reshaped the nation's sense of self. Streets once filled with despair now buzzed with pride. Young men and women who had thought of migration as their only future started applying for new jobs in local industries. Farmers who had seen their crops rot on the ground began to sell tomatoes to processing plants built in their own land. To a generation raised on disappointment, the sudden sense of possibility felt almost unreal. But the transformation was not without risk. In the medium term, Traoré's choices placed his country on a collision course with powerful interests. By refusing to export unrefined gold, he disrupted long-standing channels of profit for Europe. By sending French troops away, he challenged a military tradition of dependency that dated back to colonial days. By rejecting loans from the IMF, he raised eyebrows in Washington and Paris, where financial leverage had long been used to dictate African policy. These decisions inspired citizens, yet they also tightened the circle of threats. Diplomats whispered of sanctions. Neighboring states, uneasy about the fire of popular support spilling across borders, weighed their options. Even within Burkina Faso, elites who had grown comfortable with external patronage looked nervously at the loss of influence. Still, for many ordinary people, the benefits outweighed the risks. The idea that a home is a human right gave villagers a sense of dignity long denied. The reduction of ministerial salaries signaled a government willing to share in sacrifice. Even symbolic acts, such as banning French media, resonated deeply, reminding people that their voices no longer had to pass through foreign filters. The political consequences were equally profound. In cafes and markets, conversations shifted from complaints about corruption to debates over sovereignty. Diaspora youth, often disconnected from the politics of their ancestral lands, began to engage with passion. For them, Traoré's stand was not only about Burkina Faso, it was about the entire continent reclaiming its agency. This was not just governance, it was the rebirth of identity. And yet the cost of such boldness cannot be ignored. Economically, isolation loomed as a possibility. Investors hesitated, fearing instability. Regional trade networks trembled under pressure from outside powers. Diplomatically, some African leaders distanced themselves, unwilling to be drawn into confrontation with France or America. For the diaspora elders watching, the situation stirred both pride and caution. They had seen dreams like this before, Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism, Sankara's revolution, only to witness them destroyed. They worried that once again the machinery of global power might crush what was being built. Still, their hearts clung to hope, believing that perhaps this time history could bend differently. In churches and community halls, a single refrain began to echo, "If we do not defend this, who will?" It was both a question and a challenge. If Africans themselves, both at home and abroad, failed to stand firm, then Traore's experiment would collapse under the same weight that buried past leaders. But if they chose unity, the trajectory of an entire continent might shift. So I must ask you, our viewers, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, will you raise your voice in the comments and declare your stand? The stakes are clear. A brighter tomorrow is being built brick by brick in Burkina Faso. But as the foundations take shape, enemies circle like vultures waiting for the chance to strike. And we must wonder, when the pressure grows heavier, will the spirit of resilience carry Traoré and his people through, or will history's shadows return to claim another dream too soon? Outside Burkina Faso's borders, the rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré has been met with a mixture of fascination, suspicion, and alarm. No one has watched more nervously than France. Once the unquestioned overseer of its former colonies, Paris suddenly found itself unwelcome. French troops were told to leave. French media outlets, long accused of bias, were banned. For decades, France had relied on African gold, uranium, and influence to sustain its global standing. Now a young soldier was cutting those cords one by one. The French establishment reacted with outrage. Politicians in Paris denounced Traoré as reckless, while analysts on French television warned of destabilization. Yet for many Africans, these warnings sounded like hypocrisy. After all, who had destabilized Africa more than those who exploited it for centuries? In Washington, the response was more measured but equally wary. The United States has long relied on the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as tools of influence. When Traoré rejected IMF loans, it was seen not merely as economic independence, but as defiance of a global order carefully maintained. American officials spoke of concerns for stability and regional security, phrases that often mask deeper anxieties about losing control. Within Africa itself, reactions were divided. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, hesitated. Some member states, heavily dependent on Western support, were quick to distance themselves. Others, especially those grappling with their own population's anger at foreign influence, offered quiet support. The African Union released statements about dialogue and peace, but in the streets of Dakar, Lagos, and Johannesburg, ordinary Africans chanted a different message: leave Traoré alone. Russia and other non-Western powers, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Moscow, already deepening ties in Mali and the Central African Republic, signaled its readiness to strengthen cooperation with Burkina Faso. For Russia, Traoré's defiance of the West was a strategic opening. For Traoré, it was a chance to diversify alliances. Whether this was a genuine partnership or simply another form of dependency remained to be seen. European institutions, particularly the EU, voiced unease. They framed their concerns around democracy and governance, yet their deeper fear was clear. If Burkina Faso's path proved successful, other Francophone nations might follow. The domino effect would unravel decades of European influence. Through all this, one reality emerged. Traoré had become more than a national figure. He was now a symbol in the global contest between old powers and new voices. Some called him reckless, others called him visionary, but no one could ignore him. The question, however, lingers like a shadow. As the world takes sides, is Burkina Faso becoming the stage for yet another proxy struggle where the dreams of its people risk being swallowed by the ambitions of greater powers? And so we must ask, will the global spotlight protect Traoré, or will it draw even fiercer storms upon him and his nation? The story of Ibrahim Traoré is still being written. It is not only the tale of one man, but of an entire continent standing at a crossroads. Ahead lie two paths, one marked by confrontation, the other by renewal. The first path is perilous. Western governments, unwilling to lose influence, may tighten economic screws, isolate Burkina Faso, or fuel unrest through covert means. Sanctions could cripple industries before they have time to bloom. Borders could be manipulated, neighbors pressured, and propaganda spread to fracture the fragile unity now growing. History shows us that the guardians of empire do not surrender their grip without a fight. The second path, however, is alive with possibility. If Africans choose unity, if the diaspora remains engaged, if leaders across the continent resist the temptation of foreign bribes, then a new model could emerge. An Africa that refines its own gold, processes its own food, builds its own industries, and educates its own youth could set the standard for what African development truly means. No longer a client of Europe or America, Africa could become the author of its own destiny. Elders across the diaspora remind us that unity is more than a slogan. It is a discipline, a daily choice to see beyond tribal lines, beyond borders drawn in colonial capitals, beyond the petty rivalries that weakened generations past. Traoré's call for sovereignty has meaning only if it inspires millions of small acts of responsibility, from farmers cultivating their fields with pride, to students committing to learn, to communities protecting their resources from exploitation. This moment is also spiritual. Across churches in Jamaica, mosques in Senegal, and community halls in Chicago, prayers rise for protection. The old know what is at stake. They remember the sorrow of betrayal, and they whisper to the young, "Do not repeat our mistakes. Stand firm." The ancestors who endured slavery and colonial rule did not dream of comfort. They dreamed of dignity. Now their descendants have a chance to seize it. But opportunity without vigilance can fade quickly. The loyalty of soldiers must be preserved. The honesty of leaders must be demanded. The voices of ordinary Africans must remain louder than the whispers of foreign agents. For the vision of a new Africa cannot rest on one man alone. It must be carried by millions. The choice lies before us all. Will Africa stumble again, or will it march together into a new era of strength? And as this chapter unfolds, one question burns brighter than ever. Will this generation be remembered as the one that let history repeat itself, or the one that finally broke the cycle? The journey of Captain Ibrahim Traoré is more than politics. It is a mirror held up to Africa's soul, reflecting both its wounds and its unyielding strength. From the moment he declared that health, education, and housing were rights rather than privileges, he shifted the conversation from survival to dignity. From the day he expelled foreign troops and banned exploitative contracts, he reminded us that independence means little if it is not defended daily. For elders in the diaspora, his rise stirs bittersweet memory. They recall Lumumba silenced in 1961, Nkrumah betrayed in 1966, Sankara cut down in 1987, and Gaddafi bombed in 2011. They carry the grief of watching giants fall. Yet they also see in Traoré the chance for a new chapter. Perhaps at last Africa might learn from its losses and refuse to bow again. This moment is bigger than Burkina Faso. It is about the dream of anti-colonial Africa, where nations no longer bend to outside dictates, where resources fuel local progress, and where leaders answer first to their people. It is about the long-awaited dawn of genuine African development, born not from charity or loans, but from self-reliance and unity. But dreams are fragile. Without vigilance, they fade. Without unity, they fracture. That is why the responsibility does not rest on Traoré alone. It belongs to every African farmer, every Caribbean singer, every Black American teacher, every elder who remembers the struggle, and every youth determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The world is watching and history is listening. Will we rise as a people and defend what is ours, or will we let the same shadows fall again? If this story touches your heart, do not let it pass silently. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. For too long, our history was silenced. Now let us speak our future aloud. Let us build the voice of anti-colonial Africa together. So I ask you, elders and youth alike, when the next generation looks back, will they see that we stood together, that we chose courage over fear, that we turned mourning into hope? Or will they wonder why, once again, Africa hesitated at the edge of freedom? The choice is ours. The time is now.